Well, it's been quite a while since I've done a podcast over on this side. If you're familiar with the podcast, Finding Traction is a podcast where I talk generally about all sorts of things related to walking away from porn and walking towards a better life. And on this podcast, Pastors on Porn, really we're dealing with issues related to just the pastor's struggle, especially around areas of unmanageable sexual behaviors, a safe place to deal with the combination of somebody in ministry and people who are sexual beings and trying to navigate that, trying to find a way to talk about and a place to talk about some of the common struggles that just take place in ministry and some of the areas we find ourselves off in the weeds and trying to find our way back. And so this podcast hopefully is a place that some of those questions could be answered, specifically if you are a person who is involved in vocational ministry. And today's topic is something, it's a bit of a pet peeve. It's a bit of a beef I have, and I'm going to call this podcast Jesus Never Journaled. And I'm going somewhere with this, so you'll kind of figure out where I'm going here. But let me just say this. If you've listened to the podcast for any period of time, and if you're involved in ministry, in the helping professions, you know how much I have spoken about the importance of self-care. As I'm talking and working with pastors, I'm always asking questions like things like, what are you doing for rest? What does your day off look like? When are you taking a day off? Talk to me about that. I'm pushing pastors to say, how long have you been pastoring? How long has it been since you were on a sabbatical? Have you ever been on a sabbatical? I pastored for close to 30 years, took 3 sabbaticals. And, or I'll even ask people, one of the things we check in is a simple question. We talk about, well, what are your passions? And they say, well, what do you mean? I say, well, tell me this. What is one thing you're looking forward to doing this week? I mean, genuinely and honestly looking forward. When someone doesn't have a quick answer to that, then I know we've got work to do. Trouble is on the horizon. So I am a big proponent of self-care. I'm also a proponent of self-examination, or, us examining our lives in, along with God's help and other people, connection with other people. It says, search me, O Lord, search me, O God, and know my heart. I'm big on that. This idea that we need to examine our lives. An unexamined life is not a good thing. So I'm big on that. And I'm also big on healing. Every pastor will eventually need to turn and face how their woundedness is playing into their brokenness. Let me say that again. Every pastor, you don't get very far in ministry before you have to realize, you know what? My woundedness is playing into my brokenness. My woundedness is even playing into the way that I'm leading people. So let me just say all of that as a bit of a preamble. However, I want to push back on a few things that I've heard, good advice, well-meaning advice that was given to me over all of these years of being a pastor, which has left me struggling with feeling unspiritual at one level, feeling shallow, feeling inadequate. And it came from people who spoke to pastors, well-meaning voices, who say, what you need to do is this, right? So, for example, people would say, if you're going to uncover your brokenness, then you need to be super introspective. and I would feel incredibly inadequate there because I am not an introspective person, right? So I had a very difficult time looking inward and figuring out what my brokenness was. Or it just felt like I was always chasing something and never being able to catch it. So that always left me feeling inadequate. Or somebody else saying, if you are going to be a godly person, you need to be super contemplative. There's books out there. The book, The Contemplative Pastor. I've read it. Okay. And it's got some good stuff in it. I've read, other things from like Peter Scazzaro, other people. And I always come away, there's good stuff in some of these approaches, but I always feel inadequate. I always feel shallow. I always feel like I'm not contemplative enough. And then the final one, in order to really hear and interact from God, you need to journal. And I want to say, Jesus never journaled. Okay, so where am I going with this? Here's the point. Oftentimes, well-meaning advice is given to us that doesn't take into account the way God created us and designed us. For example, one of the books that I have found tremendously freeing is Sacred Pathways by Gary Thomas. Discover your soul's path to God. And one of the things that he mentioned in his book is that different people interact with God in very different ways. So, for example, in his book, he talks about 9 spiritual temperaments or pathways. He talks about the naturalists, people who especially feel close and connected with God when they're outdoors. The sensates, those who worship God with their senses. The traditionalists, those who love rituals and liturgy and sacraments and symbols, those kind of things. Things that are done over and over again. Ascetics, loving God in solitude and simplicity, right? The ascetics. Activists, loving God through involvement, engagement, or standing up against injustice. Caregivers, loving God by loving others. The enthusiasts, those who love God with mystery and celebration. And contemplatives, those who love God through adoration, right? There's other, I think I'm missing one here. Oh yeah, intellectuals, those who love God with their mind, love getting into books and research. Now, those are 9 different sorts of personalities, 9 different sorts of pathways to God. But what is often held up as the only way that you need to be connected with God, if you're not doing this, then you are somehow less than a Christian. Take, for example, the ascetics, loving God in solitude. Have you ever heard a message, from somebody who is involved in spiritual formation saying, if you are not spending significant times in solitude, are you even a Christian? How could you grow? How could you do those things, right? If you are not a contemplative person, right? How is it that you're even in ministry? And this phrase, Jesus never journaled, right? Now I know, of course, he didn't journal because we didn't have, Staples or Office, Macs to give us paper, back then. The point is this: there are lots of different ways that self-care looks. This whole idea that, to be a pastor, to be a leader, you need to be a contemplative ascetic / intellectual, is just doing a large portion of pastors a disservice. Yeah, maybe if you're wired to, you lose yourself in books and study, that is an area where you love connecting with God, love being alone, love being in solitude, right? But what if you're not wired that way? Maybe the best way for you to connect with God is out at a river stream with a fishing rod in your hand. Maybe there God is going to speak to you. When I get alone in a room with just a notepad of paper, everything's quiet. I've gone on these 2-3 day retreats, right? And because that's what I was supposed to do. So you know how it is. You just take your Bible with you, and you get rid of all distractions. You go away in a 2-3 day retreat, and you sit down with a Bible and a notepad. And after an hour or two, you're drawing up, penises on the page or something. I don't know what you're doing, but you're just going, I don't know, and, people are saying, well, listen to the voice of God. And you're going, well, I don't, you're just completely a fish out of water. Now, you might be thinking, Vern, how did you ever become a pastor? Right? The point is, that was not the way that I was wired. Right? That for me was the worst case scenario for hearing from God. And yet that was the model that I was told was true, godly, contemplative pastors, look for. It's like back in the 70s, of course, when, the huge church from South Korea was, I forget the guy who wrote all the books about prayer. And it's, if you're not up at 4 a.m. praying, or 5 a.m, I listen and I pray and I obey. And that was the model. So every pastor would listen to the books from South Korea, and they said, well, I guess I got to get up at 4 or 5 a.m. and pray for 2 hours, and then my church is going to explode. Right. And, stuff like that. Right. So, I guess my point here is that, we really need to ask ourselves, what do I need to do to stay alive and fresh in my relationship with God? And that's where, and we need to ask ourselves that in relationship to the way God has created us and wired us. Let me also say a question about our brokenness as well. I am a big proponent that God at some point will reach into our lives and say, it's now time for us to deal with this brokenness you've been carrying with you for 5, 10, 15, 20 years or longer. I went through probably a 2-year period of time where God continually was showing me and then healing in me issues around my relationship with my dad, around the father heart of God. I'd grown up on a farm where the only way I could get my dad's attention or his affection was through my hard work. And this whole idea that I had this gaping hole in my life, by the time I was hitting my later 20s and early 30s, God was beginning to speak to me. And we went through probably a couple-year process where God again and again would speak to me and say, you are my son whom I love. I am delighted in you. You are the apple of my eye. I am proud of you. And I began to grow in my sense that I didn't need to perform or work to get my father's approval, my father's affection, my father's delight. But the point was this, it was very much a God-led thing. And I don't think that I could have simply said, okay, it's time for me now to uncover all of my brokenness and say, for the next 3 months, I'm going to clear away all the brokenness in my life. God needs to lead us in those times and places. And I think a good coach a good spiritual director, whatever that is, can really say, what is God pressing on your heart today? In us, sometimes we can feel like, okay, if I'm going, and this is another place we can feel inadequate, unless I can somehow understand and deal with all of my childhood issues, I can't be an effective pastor. I think we need to be, again, open to what is God putting his finger on right now? What is God saying right now? And if you're not overly introspective and God's not saying or speaking anything to you, then I wouldn't spend a lot of time on it. Right? So once again, I would just say, how has God made you? How has God created you? And let's go back to this original idea of, what does self-care look like for you? And so, I wanted to come back to this. I am all for people getting healed up. I'm all for people hearing from God. I'm all for people dealing with their woundedness in their life. But I would love to say to you, what are you looking forward to this week? How has God made you? How are you going to grow in self-care? Don't put on anybody else's armor. Ask yourself really clearly and honestly, what do I need to do to grow and thrive for the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years in this role? And if you want to journal, go ahead and journal. But I'm just saying, Jesus never journaled. We'll see you next time.